All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of our TSG podcast. I have another guest with us for this episode, another one of my teammates, Coach Julianna. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to get to have a fun conversation today.
Yeah, definitely. It should be a good one. And something that has been asked of me before, like I've even had people ask me on my Instagram stories before, is basically figuring out their training split. And I kind of think about it like, maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, it was kind of normal to just do one lift per session. And now it's more normal to do two or three lifts per session. So people are always asking, well, should they do SBD sessions? So I guess like the first question I'll throw out to you is kind of, do you use SBD sessions for your clients? And what would you say kind of like the breakdown is of how many do it versus how many don't?
Yeah, so kind of to give a little bit background on myself, that way people have a little bit better understanding of where I'm coming from too. I've been coaching for about 5 years and been powerlifting for about, I think, technically 10 in terms of meets and then 11 in terms of like doing the actual power lifts. So, with that kind of in mind, I've had a lot of different clients, and I'd say, as with all of the things that we discuss in our like group chats and overall, a lot of things are heavily individualized in terms of what's going to work for one client or one athlete might not work for another athlete. But when it comes to SBD sessions, I kind of view them as something that we will incorporate if it truly makes sense for that client. So, pros that I've generally seen associated with those SBD sessions is some people, it's very difficult to get into the gym more than or usually 3 or 4 days a week. And like you said, once you get to a certain point, doing squat, bench, especially bench, once a week or twice a week is no longer like helping move that needle forward. So for these clients or athletes who are generally like only able to get in a couple times a week, I found that SBD sessions can be a great way for them to kind of have everything condensed into one particular session and then maybe have the other sessions be a little bit shorter, or if, like mentioned, if they can't get in to the gym more than however many times, it kind of allows them to get all of the main lifts in the more specific stuff. So obviously SBD is highly specific. That's another thing. It gives you that exposure to the meet order. And so I like to incorporate those a lot more as we get closer to a meet too, because it does give clients or athletes the experience of like how bench will feel after they squat or how deadlift will feel after squat and bench. Like, we oftentimes don't think about the fact that our performance is going to be after these other high impact, high intensity performances on, squat and bench, putting up 98 to 102, whatever it kind of looks like, percent of your max. That, like, going into deadlift, yes, we all have adrenaline, but might not be as used to feeling some of that tiredness from the rest of the day. So I find that that can be really beneficial for athletes to kind of get at least a little bit of exposure to that prior. Do you have a specific like aspect or thing that you look for when you're including SBD sessions?
I think it was actually interesting. I want to go back to a point that you made about the limited time that people have, because a lot of people
Yeah,
don't think about that factor. But like when we people fill out our sign up form, they kind of put how many days are available. And you have the people that put, I can do as many days as possible, or the people that love being in the gym, they want to be in there 5 or 6 days.
definitely.
But then you have the people that are on the lower end, like, hey, I can only be there 4 days, I can only be 3 days. And so a benefit to using SPD sessions is, hey, if someone can only train 3 times per week and they still want to do maybe 2 or 3 times bench press, 2 times squat, and 2 times deadlift, then you have to use that SPD session in order to get the required frequency in. So that's like an aspect for people who maybe have limited days due to work, family, whatever else, to use that as a way to kind of get the frequency in. Um, For me, I don't use SBD sessions that often because I do work with a lot of athletes that can do 4 or 5 times per week, and it's pretty easy to spread the frequency throughout. So we're doing 2 lifts per session just to keep them on the shorter side and allow for more accessory work. But there are times where then I have to put in SBD sessions in to get the required frequency, like you had mentioned. Or, for example, if someone does train with much higher frequency, if someone does like 5 times per week bench pressing, maybe 3 times per week squatting and deadlifting, then sometimes we have to force 1 or 2 SBD sessions in there to get that frequency in. So it does happen for me sometimes, but I would say I don't use it that often. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, as far as the sport form, is a lot of times I'll try and put squat and deadlift together in the same session to kind of get that benefit. And have you use that same approach that you want to kind of get the person delving in a fatigue state so you can just do squat and deadlift together rather than doing a full SBD session?
Yeah, I've definitely used that. And like, similar to you, I have a lot of clients who can be in the gym for maybe even 5 days a week, and having like squat and then deadlift does set them up really well to have that exposure there. And I think a benefit of only having the two, and I think a lot of people like hype up, okay, doing a lot of SBD days, or frankly like just hitting heavy SBD days quite frequently, is a commonality or side effect of that is those can be very long and can be very mentally taxing, because if they are going for a single and back downs, or if they are doing a lot of sets. Like, I have clients that sometimes if the SBD day is like all that fits into their program, that day it by itself will be 2 to 3 hours, and that is a lot. Of course, I'm not having that for everybody, but in those particular cases, it's true that can be very long and very taxing. And I think a benefit of having just the squat and deadlift, or even sometimes I'll do bench and deadlift or squat and bench, kind of give people that exposure of like, okay, what is this going to feel like after doing these other lifts? Yes, the doing squat and deadlift together, of course, will like have a higher like load because of like fatigue load kind of thing, because both of them being a less upper body, more like full body style movement, especially going into the deadlift, like having just done squat. But I do see the benefit of also having like I mentioned, a bench and then deadlift. I have had a few clients that find that their backs will cramp up a little bit more often off a bench and going into deadlift. So then we know, okay, how do we address that? How do we go about navigating that when we're in a competition setting or something along those lines? So I definitely think that, having a combination of the lifts is important generally. Does it need to be a combination of SBD every single time or quite frequently? I don't believe so at all. I think that is kind of a over prioritized discussion nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, agree. And you brought another point. So for some people, they have the limitation of the number of days per week. Then you have the people that have the limitation of the time per session. So if
Totally.
someone has unlimited time per session, then sure, I can do SBD sessions or I can do squat and deadlift plus accessory work. But if someone has more limited time per session, I may do squat and bench press together or bench and deadlift together, or maybe even have to do certain sessions where I'm just doing one lift so that during the week, maybe they have less time. They just do just deadlift. And then on the weekends, maybe if they have more time, then we can do squat and deadlift or SBD together. So yeah, that's the other factor, is how much time the person has per session. So I do sometimes give athletes squat and deadlift together if they have time, and then bench press in a separate session, because then they have like a upper body, lower body split where they're more
Totally.
flexible. They can do Monday and Tuesday back to back and be fine, and then do Thursday and Friday back to back if they're doing, 4 sessions per week. And that way also then have flexibility to move the sessions around if they need to. But it is, again, yeah, longer sessions. So if someone has more limited time, we have to kind of play around with it there.
Yeah.
But
Oh, I was gonna just add in another factor that oftentimes I'm considering is, and I kind of alluded to it with the mentally taxing or psychologically stimulating aspect of SBD, is like some clients find they really enjoy those sessions. And so if I know that, okay, one of my athletes really enjoys because she's there with friends on her Saturdays, and that's the day that she can take however long makes sense. And like during the week, she has less time, like you mentioned. Yes, absolutely, we'll fill out that day with a longer session or a more specific session. But just wanted to add that, like, yes, this is very much where the coach needs to factor in the psychological side of the athlete too.
yeah, the other question I was going to ask you in regards to SPD sessions and or even just like squat and delf is in general, do you find when athletes sign up with you that maybe they are under conditioned or deconditioned to doing a powerlifting competition, that they see their delf have a negative effect from doing squat and bench press beforehand and they have to do these sessions to improve? Or do you find that in general people are conditioned well enough for competitions and you don't need to implement this strategy?
I find that it I'll say I haven't noticed a specific pattern like associated with people who are signing up with me if they're more need more conditioning in that way. But what I do notice is that it's more dependent on like the length of time that people have been in the sport and like how much they're used to the frequency that they're generally doing. And like, so with that said, yes, sometimes there are certain athletes that are coming in and just are not used to having to go through a full session and of high intensity loads or doing squat and deadlift. In those cases, I'm actually usually not initially giving them an SBD day because a lot of times I'm like, okay, I don't know if they'd be able to handle all of that at once. So in your question, like to prepare for competition, I'm kind of taking them from, hey, right now you can handle one lift in your sessions, one main lift in your sessions, and are comfortably able to complete all the weights and get through that and are conditioned for it. And then it's like, okay, let's move into two per session and kind of like scaling it from there. Of course, if there's an athlete that comes to me and they're like, yeah, I'm looking to compete in 3 months or something along those lines. That's going to look very different in terms of scaling and the type of like strategy I'm going to take with them. I'm not going to have this like a little bit longer build up in terms of their ability to do work, but in general, I do like to kind of uh slowly lead people to that ability to actually be able to do all of the SBD, all of the movements on one day, just so that they do have that exposure. Because a lot of times, people I've noticed if they're just doing one or two movements or main lifts a day or a session, they get to the meet and they're like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize how much I would be doing here, like all at once. And it's like a long day and, or a short day. Meets have gotten pretty efficient now. Like there are some people that are like, whoa, that moves so fast. So it definitely is taking the athlete when they come in and being like, okay, what are you used to? What's your background? Hearing what they say, giving them that first program, seeing if that's accurate, and scaling from there. So I don't think that's like necessarily specific to a trend in like athletes or the ones that sign up with me, but just in general, like how I operate with whoever is approaching for coaching.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, sometimes people don't assess themselves properly. So that's why they're obviously coming to you as the expert. And so, yeah, they may say one thing, but who knows if they actually assess themselves correctly and what other variables are going on. But The reason why I asked it for myself, I feel like in general, yeah, if the competition's like, let's say 3.5 hours to 4.5 hours long, maybe 5 hours long, people don't have an issue from the way they train with me and the way we peak and everything and not cut too
Hmm.
much weight. Is like they don't feel too gassed out when it comes to deadlifts. When it comes to the shorter competitions, like sometimes the IPF Classic Worlds, when they're in the prime time session and it's like two
Totally.
hours, 2.5 hours long, oftentimes people do feel like it's like a sprint and they're kind of getting gassed out. And so for those kind of sessions, maybe people need to train for it. And it seems like the IPF is trying to go towards shorter sessions so they can be on Eurosport and CBS Sports and not take up the whole day and everything. So it's something that people need to practice. But yeah, for a lot of my clients, I feel like it hasn't been an issue. I want to see if I can actually share my screen real quick for people that are
Hmm.
watching the video. They can see the actual program. And then for those listening, I'll just go over it real quick as well so they can kind of get ideas. Like this is one of my athletes, Sarah Brenner, that had the world record deadlift in 84 plus, 257.5 kilograms. And we always did it because of our time where we did squat and bench press together and deadlift on a separate day. So you can see that on day one, squat and bench plus accessories, day two, deadlift plus accessories, and then it repeats. Day three, squat and bench plus accessories, and day four, deadlift plus accessories. So even with just doing deadlift on its own separate day where she was like well recovered, we were able to build her deadlift up to a world record that she hit at the North American Championships. Now, again, it wasn't a fast competition for that specific one. So maybe if it was a faster competition, we'd have to adjust accordingly by going lighter on squat at the competition or making sure we trained her properly for it. Uh, and then I just wanted to show real quick the other side. An extreme example is one of my athletes here, Kwaku, who is actually one of our TSG sponsored athletes. He came to me with already high frequency, high volume training, and he can handle a lot of training. He's a university student, so he does have a lot of time that he can dedicate to training. So just to show people an extreme example is day one, he does an SBD session plus accessory work. Day two, he does another SBD session plus accessory work. Then day three is an easier day where we're doing like variations of squat and bench press plus some accessory work. Day four, he has another SBD day plus accessory work. And then day five, we just have a variation of a bench press plus accessory work. So this is kind of high frequency, high volume, and having three SBD sessions spread out there throughout the week. We've been playing around with which exact day to do the other sessions around the SBD sessions to prioritize them. So if you're watching the video, this isn't always the exact schedule that we're doing. We've been testing out different things, but this just gives you an idea of someone on the extreme end of SBD sessions. But because he does train with such high frequency, especially on squat and bench press, this is kind of what we've had to use for him.
Yeah, this is actually fairly similar to my sponsored athlete Brittany Romas, with her current training as she goes into Australian nationals. That she is doing a lot of work, and we've built up to that prior to coming and working with me. She was doing like more of the top set back down in terms of a large differential between the intensity of one to the other. And so I would say prior, her exposure to the ability to recover from these things was a little bit lower. And so we couldn't just start out of the gate with, hey, we're, having these two higher intensity sessions, or rather two higher intensity lifts, and then still the next day do the same thing again. Even though frequency wise we definitely we determined that was needed. So it was a little bit of like, okay, we're building up that ability to handle the average load being a little bit higher. And now that she's like, this is peak week, so she's about a week and a half out. She's doing lifts that she's never done before in terms of PRs, just even in the back offs or even in the straight sets. Like, so we've built up to that ability, but we didn't start there. So I like how you showed Kwaku's program there to kind of see the dichotomy of different clients too.
Yeah, yeah. As you mentioned, as always, we individualize it. So the showing the examples is just for people to see examples, but please don't copy Kwaku's frequency if you haven't been training that kind of way. He's been training that way for I guess years before me, and that's why we've kind of continued to build upon that. And like you said, it's some people aren't at that level, which it can take time to build them if it feels it's necessary, but you have to be mindful of kind of making big adjustments. And sometimes it's even people see things online. So for example, even with Kwaku, he'll see things that Jason Urban's client Joe Jordan is doing and be like, oh well, Joe's getting back to training, 2 days after his competition. I want to get back to training. Or oh, Joe's doing like this time frequency on his squat, or whatever. I want to do this time frequency. And it's like, okay, it's good that you're motivated to do more and be able to get more, and that can help us maybe to do other methodologies or progressions if someone's like even more focused and dedicated, like, hey, I want to push harder going into the world championship. Sure, we can maybe be more aggressive and put more effort into it. But then also to be mindful of, just because this person's doing it doesn't mean you should copy it. Just because, a guy at Sitco's out there doing 6 or 7 SBD sessions a week doesn't mean that you should go and copy it. Everyone's at a different level and you have to build accordingly.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think you bring up a good kind of talking point with regards to like having multiple SBD sessions in a week. Like obviously you showed an example of, I believe it was 2. And like just mentioned Agatha, like a lot us as coaches can recognize, okay, well they're probably not doing, high intensity what's it called, high intensity sessions every single day of those 6 SBD days. They're specific to what the goal is on that day. If it's a certain training technique, or like just having the load on the back kind of thing. So there is definitely this differential between what like the public sees and like what is often shared of like, oh wow, they're doing SBD every single day. And it's like, well, yes, but that doesn't mean that we're doing 80-90% SBD every single day, because your body's gonna fall apart. Like there's a method to the madness, I'm sure, but I don't think that everybody needs that. I was just gonna reference Brittany again as an example. Like right now, her split is pretty much, she's got an SBD day, she's got a squat bench day, a bench deadlift day, and then another squat bench day. So that frequency, she's squatting 3 times a week, she's benching 4 times a week, and she's deadlifting twice. And that's just what works best for her, spreading things out. But again, like that first SBD day, that is not her what they would say primary deadlift day. That's kind of where we're getting some of our volume in, and that's kind of how I look at things in terms of spreading things out and making sure it's as optimized for the athlete as can be. And if that means an SBD day, great. If that means that we're not doing them, that's also okay too. If you do get it up, week 18 is probably a good example. Trying to acknowledge that, oh, she's going into nationals, we probably don't want to have all of her training on there. But week 18 is a good one, because it's right before getting into her competition block.
Yeah, it's the same thing, I guess, with Kwaku going into the World Championships. I've like interviewed him before. We're gonna hopefully post out the interview soon. But it's like, oh, do we want to really give out all our information going into the World Championships, or hold a little back?
Yeah. So here, this is a few weeks into her like a development block, basically moving into her competition competition block. And like this is her, on this particular one, her main squat day, what people often refer to as a primary squat day, but her deadlifts are, a little bit lower on the RPE scale, comparatively. And she still has some heavier bench, but something about Brittany is she tolerates like heavy bench, with higher, volume pretty well. So that's why we have that. But you can see that, yes, this first day is her SBD day, but the rest of the week we have squat bench, then we have bench deadlift, and all of the accessories that are paired with those are always very particular to what the athlete appears to need the most in this cycle. So for this one, we were like, okay, we're building up her core strength as well as back strength just to be able to handle this increase in load that we've progress to over time with her deadlift, because she's doing a lot more than she used to be doing, and then also targeting, some tricep strength. So that really shows up all throughout the our program. So that last day of training, day 4, her bench, it's a 3x8, an RP6. It's a lot lower. This is kind of more of a quote unquote recovery day for her. But this is the structure that works well in terms of her getting exposure to that SBD style, having the higher intensity lifts or higher intensity main lifts on the same day, so that once we moved into the competition phase, it was like a seamless transition for her.
I like how you also added in here for day 2. Jason kind of calls it guardrails for the athlete, is
Mm-hmm.
basically like giving them ways to adjust to training based on how things are going. And you could do it a number of different ways. But here I like how after the SBD session, if for some reason she's just like gassed out, especially maybe on bench press from the heavier bench press, you put here like, hey, if the RP is above 8.5, then just drop the load to get down to the proper RP so that then they can complete the rest of the sessions, comfortably and be able to not get too much fatigue buildup going into next week's SBD session. So you have that naturally built in that like, hey, if for some reason my assumption of what you can do is off, then you just adjust day 2 down and get us back on the right track.
Definitely. And I really like using those guardrails in terms of when we're pushing weight, or like we're pushing the needle forward more intensely on any particular lift. And that's exactly what I was doing there with that bench press, in terms of we had just upped her at training 1 rep max, and it was like, okay, we're moving into some true PRs every single set on this 4x4. But if the load is too much, we're gonna back down. So yeah, I agree with there having some balance between okay, being the coach, here's what you're gonna do, but then giving the client the autonomy to, hey, recognize if we're pushing too hard, or this is worse on this day, or you're someone like me that if your body weight's down, suddenly your bench is gonna go to crap. Like, know how to adjust. So yeah, I love those.
The other thing I was going to ask you about that you mentioned earlier in our discussion is that sometimes you may change the training split inside of a macro cycle, like
Mm-hmm.
going into a competition, then you may bring in the SBD sessions. So I was just wondering, do you tend to do it maybe like during the competition phase around like 4 weeks out? Do you do it maybe during the development phase, like 8 or 12 weeks out, or does it just really vary from person to person?
I would say my preference is the 8 to 12 weeks, and kind of building up in terms of how intense those are, if they are intense. It's dependent on the person, in that, if they're already pretty experienced with SPD days, or not SPD days, excuse me, with competitions, they've shown that they don't have any sort of weight drop off or anything of that nature, then I don't necessarily deem it like, okay, we need to add those in. Or I see it as like, okay, the last couple weeks, they're more adapted already to being able to handle that. But largely, my preference is like the 8 to 12 week range, having them, if we're going to incorporate an SBD day, incorporate that in, and then kind of progress it from there into the competition phase. But I've also had clients that are like, hey, Juliana, I know I'm 4 weeks out and we're lifting 4 days a week, but work just got crazy. I'm only going to be able to do 3. And then we have to adapt to that. And with in that type of situation, a lot of times it is combining days. So bringing a day that previously was a squat bench day, and then another day was maybe deadlift bench, having to put it together and have a squat bench deadlift, and then kind of seeing if and where that extra bench fits. If it needs to be spread out via the different sets across different days. If we determine, oh, that other bench day was a a close grip bench right now as we go into competition. I don't see that being our main driver. We can remove that safely. But ideally, 8 to 12 weeks is like, yeah, if we're going to add something in, let's add it in there and then not change too much.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Personally, I feel like, yeah, obviously I adjust based on if someone's schedule changes inside of a training cycle. But I guess maybe I'm like set in my way sometimes. I like to like stick to one training split at the beginning of the macro cycle and just go all the way through with that. Like keep things as simple as possible and adjust other variables. So like, yeah, for me, like on week one of the macro cycle one here, I would design whatever I think the training split is best for that person and just stick with that through.
Mm-hmm.
I know some people, yeah, like to change frequency or even the training split within the macro cycle. And so, yeah, if I was going to do that, if I felt like I needed to put in SBD sessions, I like your idea of, yeah, starting it farther out during a development phase. So you have more time to test and adjust back if things aren't going well. If you make that change like at 4 weeks out, as you're about to peak and go heavy, and then like things are deteriorating quickly, well, you don't have a lot of time to make adjustments and get back to something that's going to work successful for them. So, yeah, giving yourself more time seems like the better way to do things.
Yeah, and I'll add that this is probably in to some capacity a difference in our athletes too that kind of usually sign up with us. I know for me, I have a lot of athletes that do require some flexibility due to their work constraints or due to like I still have a few different university athletes as well, but they're like schedules are all over the place and also some athletes that need a little bit more time as we make adjustments due to different, I don't want to put any sort of label, but different like mental health things, like okay, we just need to go a little bit slower in terms of making big adjustments, and or might have something pop up that we have to make those changes. So I definitely find myself with more having to approach often with more flexibility because of that. And that's like my bias too, because of my experience and the athletes I've worked with.
Yeah. So I think that, seems like it mostly covers the topic. Hopefully people found some helpful information as like, hey, start off with figuring out how many days per week can you train? Then maybe figure out how much time per session can you dedicate? Then from there you
Mm-hmm.
start breaking down into, yeah, what kind of frequency do you need per lift to figure out how to design the individual week? You know, having flexibility if your schedule changes from week to week. Do you want to maybe change certain have SBD sessions on certain weeks where you have fewer days per week or maybe closer to a competition, or if your schedule is kind of more standard and you can kind of stick with one kind of training split throughout the entire way. And then as always, don't just copy what someone else is doing. Figure out where you're at and what you need to progress. And then depending on what level you are, if you're doing local level competitions that are 4 or 5 hours long, you can probably get through it without having to do SBD sessions. If you're doing some kind
Yeah.
of, classic world championships where it's done in 2 hours or whatever like that, maybe you need to go a little bit quicker and be able to condition yourself for those kind of sessions.
Most definitely. I think that that's a great place for anybody who's thinking about adding a SBD session or like has thought about like, oh, I hear that that's the best, to consider just where you're at and what makes sense for you. And obviously a big thing out of this is having that conversation with your coach. What makes sense for you? That is a huge conversation that is ongoing with any coach.
Yeah. So the second topic I want to jump into is completely different to SBD sessions, but I think it's something that's important that we want to discuss is
Mm-hmm.
basically, women in sports, and we can obviously talk about different topics, and you've had mentioned maybe we even do different episodes on this, but maybe for today, trying to talk about specifically powerlifting coaching and the difference maybe between being a man versus a woman when it comes to coaching and powerlifting. So I don't know if there's any area you specifically want to start off with, maybe just talking about how things are right now, or if you want to talk about your experiences.
Yeah. I'll say I think it's great that we're like starting this conversation, especially today on like National Women and Girls in Sport Day. I think that's really awesome. But I would love to start kind of with a small reflection on like what I've seen in the sport in terms of female coaches. When I first started, back in 2016, my first coach was a female coach who no longer coaches, and she was also in bodybuilding. So that was kind of my exposure to a coach the first time, was someone who was bringing together these two similar but highly different sports in terms of bodybuilding and powerlifting. And like I had no problems. I was 16 at the time. I was like, yeah, this makes sense. Or 15, 16, and this works for me. And while that was my experience, and I have had that experience of having like a female coach, I wouldn't say that that's the norm for a lot of people. In terms of, at the same time, looking at the state of powerlifting coaching and, you know, trying to reflect on 2016, 2015 era, I wouldn't say that female powerlifting coaches were all that popular, albeit I am certainly, you know, biased from my knowledge. So, you know, whatever I was exposed to on social media is my knowledge on that. But you know, I knew a few. It was like, I think at that time, like Sam Calhoun, a lot of my friends got into powerlifting via Meg squats, like a few key women, I would say, that definitely, definitely like showed up in the way of, hey, there are women in powerlifting, there are women in this sport, and there are coaches in this sport. And I think in the past 10 years, this has progressed quite a bit. We see a lot more consistently women coaching in powerlifting. I mean, Kelly Mann being the first female coach to coach at to coach at Sheffield, and a lot of the Sheffield competitors are coaches themselves. I'm thinking like Meg Scanlon, Alba, and I'm definitely not naming so many, but we're seeing more publicity or more exposure to the concept that females are coaches, and females are coaches in powerlifting. I think first we had to see the rise in female athletes in powerlifting, which was, you know, is ongoing, but I would say definitely has grown quite a bit from when I first started. I remember being like consistently one of the few female teens at the time that I would see, and I think I would go against maybe 4 or 5 athletes at nationals in like teen 1 and teen 2, teen 3, whatever it was. And now you're not seeing those numbers. There's, you know, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but just a lot more going on. And I think that the number of female coaches increasing is respective to also the number of female athletes. So I believe that's why those conversations need to come together. Do I think that it's on the same level of the male coaching in terms of exposure and the amount? No, but that's another topic that I'm sure we'll get into here in a second.
Yeah, I'll try and share my screen again. There's something that I actually went over with Jason when we recorded our episode together, which is basically, you know, like the current state of powerlifting and the growth of powerlifting. And one of the things we can look at is the difference as far as the percentage of like men and women in powerlifting. So this is just looking at, I believe it should be just IPF competitions. And so this website, Powerlifting and Data, has a number of different things. So yeah, this is first competition for women in IPF affiliates. And so we can see just in the IPF here, how if we go back to like, you know, the 70s or 80s, basically like 0 to 10%. And then as we go from like the 80s to 90s, you know, 10 to 20%, it kind of just was stagnant through the 90s and the 2000s around like 20%. And then when we kind of got maybe the more recent boom, like with CrossFit and everything like that in the 2010s, then you can see there's this huge rise up to kind of like 30%, 35%. And I know even from like USA Powerlifting's membership data for a number of years, it was kind of that 65-35 split. And then you can see
Mm-hmm.
now it's kind of like settled in here around that 30%. So we definitely have had a rise of like first time powerlifters, which obviously then means you're going to have more women in the sport as far as athletes. And as you said, that can lead to more women coaches and obviously everything else, referees, meet directors, all that kind of stuff in powerlifting as well. So it is kind of related to it. So yeah, I'm definitely kind of seeing the same trend, which is like
Mm-hmm.
when I did my first competition in February 2011, so it's coming up on whatever 15 years, something like that, was it was a local Florida competition. Now it's part of our Florida State University. And at our university club, we had a decent split between men and women. So we brought, I think, like 8 women to the competition, and there was only like 11 total. So we brought like pretty much all
Mm-hmm.
the women to the competition. And now you go to the local competitions, like I've run some up in New York City that were like a 50-50 split between men and women. And so it's definitely changed from when I've started. So I've definitely seen an increase at certain levels. Obviously, it's more. Other levels is kind of like that 65-35 split.
Yeah, and I think that that trend will generally continue. There's different factors that I think then lead to, okay, someone deciding to begin coaching, and like what are the barriers or the facilitators to doing that, and so on. And then that obviously impacts the number of female coaches, like kind of like if we're saying that there's some element of pipeline from, hey, an athlete is a, or excuse me, a power lifter is the athlete first and then becomes a coach. Um, that does have that tendency, but I think that it's unsurprising that there is still that discrepancy. It's not like 50-50 in membership, and we're just continuing to build it. And some of that's from um the powerlifting being what it is, and like the, what's it called, the public opinion or public view of lifting and women in lifting and so on and so forth, that has improved, like you've noted with the stats there, improved in terms of participation and viewpoint over the past several years, but is continuing to battle different stigmas and different biases and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And it's interesting. I was watching a New York Times video today about like how weightlifting has blown up in America, and it just went over like
Mm-hmm.
the timeline from like the 1930s till now, and how things have changed, and how even like back then, some doctors wouldn't recommend lifting weights because they're saying like the muscle is bad for you, especially if you're like an athlete, that slows you down and stuff like that. And so there's like these stigmas about like lifting weights in general for men or women. And then like when steroids came around, there's a stigma that like everyone was taking steroids and it's bad for you. And so really they were saying how like Arnold Schwarzenegger made it very popular during the 80s, and then CrossFit has made it very popular more recent. And so we're getting this growth in US, but then also people may not factor in that different regions and different cultures may be different than what we have in the US. So for example, talking to some lifters in the Asian region, they say that they're like it's still a stigma for women to lift weights and for women to go into the gym. So while maybe the percentage is more closely to 50-50 in the US or in Americas and Europe, it may not be the same, for example, in Asia. Or the same thing like in Muslim cultures, women aren't supposed to
Totally.
maybe lift weights or aren't allowed to compete in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and there's even within policy and rules at the powerlifting level, there are different things that like keep that difference there or can contribute to that. Like I think that was just recently, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, they added like, okay, you can, like an individual can be having the full length powerlifting singlet, or wearing a hijab while they're lifting, things along those lines that are more culturally cognizant than previously. So that, I mean, that's getting into more of cultural differences, possibly ethnicity differences, racial differences, but that does impact, in a lot of cases, female athletes disproportionately.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. So we've kind of went over, yeah, a little bit about female powerlifters and female coaches and kind of how it's changed from when you started. I want to ask you a question that might be, a tough question, maybe something people don't want to think about or discuss, but I think it's
Hmm.
important is like, do you think if a powerlifter is looking to pick a coach and they're saying, okay, there's all these coaches out here from all these companies or whatever, and they're different prices and different services, do you think they're less likely to hire a female coach compared to a male coach these days?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and one that, like you said, a lot of people don't want to talk about or don't want to acknowledge. But I guess in this, I'll first start with when powerlifting is unique in that it's one of the only sports that coaching is such a virtual element to it. I mean, yes, you have your I don't want to say basic, but your general strength training. Yes, there's bodybuilding coaching that's also virtual, but you're not seeing a lot of like soccer athletes that are getting virtual coaching. It's very, very unique in that way that this opens up the doors for so many different people to coach, because access, I have, like I just talked about, Brittany Romas is in Australia. I'm able to coach her from Indiana. You have that ability. So many people like jump into coaching. And then as a result, this gives the athlete or the person looking a plethora of options, like you mentioned. And when they're going through that, I think that there's several different reasons that contribute to why someone generally picks the coach that they do, outside of whether, what their gender, their race, anything like that is. There's at the core of it, people are picking based off of personality. Do they jive with what that individual is putting out on the internet? Like, do they jive with the person who is saying like, okay, we're grinding 100%, like let me show you all of my lifts, stuff like that? Or are they jiving with someone else? So that personality element being there. Obviously achievement is another big one, and that is very prominent within, I'd say, TSG, is like, okay, you can name and list all of these different accolades that TSG athletes have had, or the coaches within TSG have had. And that's another one. People are looking at the achievement levels, both of the coach as a coach, but also as an athlete, because you do see a lot of that too. And then from there, there's the elements of like coaching style, education, more of the, what I would say, like qualifications associated with people, a little bit less like connection based, but more like, okay, do you know what you're doing kind of thing. And I wouldn't say one or one or the other of these different factors weighs for the mass majority like more than the other. I think that each person, as they pursue a coach, is going to have a different value or different factor that they value most. Myself, I might be like, okay, I value the education and the professionalism of the coach, and hence why I'm also a part of TSG and have been coached by Jason on TSG for several years. But somebody else, it might be, hey, I like what you're putting out, and I've seen other athletes that seem to like you, and that works really well for them. But within that, and I'm getting back to my point about the differences in gender, within that comes things like individual preferences and experiences. And whenever that comes about, there's unconscious biases that can play, implicit bias that can play a role. And, when it comes to coaching in general, female coaches are oftentimes like disconnected from other networks. And we've seen this in powerlifting. We've seen this discussed by several different people in terms of like who's being recommended, who's being referred to, so on and so forth. Like oftentimes female coaches, even outside of powerlifting, are excluded from this. Maybe they're also outnumbered or have like a difficult time moving up in the space simply because of some of those biases. And so that's like one factor associated with like unconscious bias just presently being there. Like people are making their choices, maybe not realizing that, oh, they never saw a female coach in any of the sport they did growing up. That's not who they think of first or even second, depending on what the situation is, of being an option. So like from a lack of role models or lack of exposure, they might be like, okay, I didn't even know it was an option. It doesn't come into my head. And that's not the person's fault necessarily. It's just by nature of the exposures and environment might be a little bit less. And there's so many things I can go into there, but with regards to like the bias and the unconscious bias versus conscious, I think that a lot of it as well, and something I didn't even realize until recently, is some people are also more or less comfortable with listening to a female, listening to a woman kind of tell them or guide them on what to do. And this, we can chalk it up to internalized sexism, whatever we want to say. But there, or even the, what's it called? The like motherhood complex. Oh, if I have a female coach telling me what to do, I view them as my mother, who I don't want to listen to my mother. Whatever. There's a ton of different psychology in that too. So with that said, I think powerlifters generally, yes, less likely to seek out a female coach than a male coach. I think that that's as a result of like exposures, biases. Obviously, there's the case of how, the amount, but I don't think there's any of us denying that like female coaches are here and present. It's just what that person is exposed to and comfortable with. Do I think that they're less likely to hire a female coach? I think that's where the values come in. The athletes' values and what they prioritize, because I think that if someone is primarily looking at seeking a coach that is their strength level, if not better, and they're a 105-kilo male, it's going to be a little bit difficult, not for everybody, but a little bit difficult for a female athlete to compete with that, or a female coach to compete with that. That's that athlete's value. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that's that athlete's value. But if they value the education and personality, flexibility, coaching style, whatever it is, and it fits well with a female coach, they're going to seek that out. I know personally, myself, I have about a 50-50 split of a male to female coaching roster. And I actually find that my male athletes are the ones that stick with me the longest. I think of my like 5 athletes that have been with me for over 3 or 4 years, of those 5, 3 of the 5 are male. And I can't say why that is, but I kind of turn back to those values, and it's like, okay, regardless of gender, if someone values a certain coaching style, a certain personality, and a certain education, that might lend itself better to a female athlete or female coach versus a male coach. But it might just come down to that value too.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned towards the end is kind of what I've experienced, which is that whether it's unconsciously or consciously, a lot of people in powerlifting maybe select their coach based on how they look or how strong they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're a female athlete, you may be looking at other female coaches or male coaches and seeing that they're maybe more in shape than you and stronger than you and selecting from the entire population. But when you're a male powerlifter, you may not look at any of the female coaches because they all may be smaller than you or weaker than you. And so then you just look at the male coaches and then from there select them. So even like someone for me, I know I've experienced that sometimes people may not pick me as a coach because like I was never a good powerlifter and I'm not like super jacked or anything like that. Even when I tell like the average person on the street, like I meet people like, hey, what do you do for a living? I'm like, oh, I'm a powerlifting coach. They're like, oh, well, you don't look like a powerlifter. That's like the first thing they say. And so that kind of natural bias, whether again, I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious from the general population, still is a little bit prevalent in powerlifters in selecting their coach. And so that sometimes that's why you see like a male powerlifter pick a powerlifting coach who's also a good competitor and is also strong versus maybe picking the person who is the most educated or has the best results and that kind of stuff like that. And so I'll get like female athletes to that select me for a coach and like, oh my God, Aaron, you're so strong because they're comparing my numbers to theirs. So like if I'm squatting 500 and they're squatting 300, it's like, oh, you're so strong, Aaron, even though they may be, pound for pound or on points
Yeah.
stronger than I am, they're just looking in absolutes. And so sometimes people I think use that to select their coach. And even when it comes to like accomplishments and achievements, sure, from like the education side, you can say, okay, one degree is the same as another, or certification is the same as other. But then when it comes to actual accomplishments in the sport, people may not hold the same weight to it or may not
Mm-hmm.
understand that they may not even realize it. What I mean by that is like I've noticed from talking to people that are specifically powerlifters that are not like coaches or anything like that, they love talking about other powerlifters like in their same weight class because they only follow like maybe their own weight class and like, hey, who do you look up to? They'll name someone in their weight class.
Yeah.
They if you ask them like, hey, tell me who your favorite person is in a different weight class or in a different gender, they have no idea because they don't follow it. So then they also don't know the accomplishments of the coach that's maybe coaching people in the women's side or a different like equipped or anything else like that because they're not even following it. They're just like following their area where that's where they compete and that's what they enjoy watching.
Yeah, and that creates the like what's so like little divisions, even little cliques almost within powerlifting, within, since it is so social media driven as well. It's like, well, you simply, as we all know, you don't know what you don't know. So like if you don't have that exposure, or you're not someone readily seeking out that exposure to varied coaches or anything of that nature, like you're simply not going to know. And like that is just how it goes. I'll say powerlifting is not that different in terms of like female coach presence comparative to like other sports. I mean, I was just looking into this a little bit earlier today, and it's like 85% of female coaches in sports are like or excuse me, like of different all girls teams or like more feminine sports, feminine, like however they view that as a sport, 85% of those coaches are female. But if you go to like a sport like basketball or baseball, that's viewed maybe a little bit more masculine, only 35% of those coaches are female. So like this type of difference and differential that we see in powerlifting is also showing up in other sports, and if not more. um I was even reading a paper by Siegel, I think is how you say it, from 2010, and it's talking about NCAA swim coaches, which I would say swimming is like pretty similar to powerlifting in that like you're competing individually, you can also compete on behalf of a team, you might have an in-person coach but can kind of seek other support. But like the types of conversations that came out in this paper about like what female coaches were, dealing with, I would say also is what we see in powerlifting. The discussion of like misidentification, basically people aren't being recognized as a coach. Like I have experienced this myself, being standing on a platform, holding onto a bar, having my polo and what's it called? What is that called? Like clipboard and everything at nationals, standing on a bar, to have somebody else walk over the platform to another individual on the other side of the platform and ask, "Oh, is someone using this platform?" That was one of those moments. It's like, okay, so you don't even recognize me as a coach, even when it's like a clearly established thing. And that same thing in this paper that I'm referencing. But then there's like differential treatment, like having different experiences between the female coaches and the male coaches. And I have an example of that one from actually a former coach and a friend of mine who like coached up an awesome athlete at nationals, and it was her and another coach in the back working with this athlete, and the other coach was male. When this person won, a different male coach came up to the male and was like, "Hey, nice work, like good job with your athlete." When all along it was the woman who had the female athlete and didn't get that same invitation of like a handshake kind of thing. So like these differing in treatments there too. And I just think that looking into the way that powerlifting is similar to other sports can be really refreshing and makes me as a female coach feel less alone too, because there is a lot of adversities and a lot of struggles associated with this, because you're like, okay, we're working to get ahead, working to get athletes, working to get clients, and then at the end of the day you also know, okay, well, some people are never gonna want to work with you because their value is associated with valuing the strength levels and, you know, female athlete comparative to the 105 kilo male. I'm not meaning to pick on the 105 kilo male. I'm just kind of using that as a example there too. So anyways, I could go on forever for this clearly, but that's kind of a lot of times where my head goes here.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up the differences in other sports because yeah, so I was kind of thinking is like in a lot of US professional sports, it's like male dominated athletes and male dominated coaches. So like NFL, NBA, MLB,
Mm-hmm.
NHL, it's all just males. So I was like thinking like, okay, which sports maybe have more female coaches, which maybe like you said, maybe like women's sports like women's basketball, softball, maybe mixed sports that are more like feminine, like gymnastics, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Um, and then even like in some individual sports, like for example, mixed martial arts, where there's women's side and men's side, the women's side still has lots of like male coaches as the head coach, or maybe all the coaches are male
Mm-hmm.
coaches as well. So I feel like powerlifting may in some ways actually be better than these other sports, in that we do have a larger population of female coaches that are involved. But I also think that it can be improved because then I'm trying to think like, well, what's actually involved for us when it comes to the coaching process? Like any person can just write the programming on a sheet. Any person can just like review the technique and analyze it. Um, any person can like handle on the day as long as they can lift a 25 kilo plate or something like that. And even things like maybe the emotional part of it or the motivation part of it, it really depends on the athlete because anyone who like watches me maybe on a live stream or watches me in the back will see like when my athlete goes out to the platform, I don't really even say anything. Like I'm not yelling out cues to them. I'm not like hyping them up. I'm not smacking them on their back, whatever. I'm just like taking their headphones off, sending them out there. Maybe just remind them to like, hey, wait for the commands and stuff like that. So like the way I kind of coach at meets too, like anybody can do that. It doesn't have to be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, I need a male coach that can like get me on the platform hyped up, whatever like that. Because I'm not doing that, and people seem to enjoy the way I handle them. They're like, oh, Aaron, you're very calm, and you know you calculate with everything like that. So I feel like it could definitely be a situation where like it's 50-50, like you said, for representation as far as athletes, but even as coaches, because there's not really too much I feel like that's going on as far as the coaching that you have to have someone who's maybe bigger or stronger or more dominant or whatever.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely just like a psychological public opinion kind of idea too, and just like what we're exposed to does impact the comfortability that we have with, you know, what you expect. You if you grow up, your exposure to sport is playing soccer all from, you know, 5 years old to 18, and you've always had male coaches. Well, you might, regardless of your own gender, you might implicitly look at two different people and be like, well, I think the male here is more likely to be a coach, and that's just what you were exposed to. That's kind of uh, those backgrounds do play a role. So you're not like faulting anybody for that, but you're right in that like these are jobs that anybody could do so long they got the, you know, willingness to learn, willingness to experience, obviously professionalism, so on and so forth. But because of like our own different exposures, policies, experiences, and so on, that impacts a little bit more of what they're of maybe even the athlete's choice. And I know for me as a female powerlifting coach, that's even something that plays a role too, is being referred to as, oh, well, you're a great female powerlifting coach. It's like, well, in that case, did we need to add the gender? Like, at what point do we have to acknowledge it? And I think that is a larger conversation there, but like, we're at the point where we're breaking barriers in powerlifting and women in powerlifting and female coaches in powerlifting, but also these are things that need to be repetitively fought with or kind of stood up to, because it is ongoing and it is continuous, and then leads to people not becoming a part of the sport or not being interested in being a female coach or whatever it looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of stole what I wanted to talk about real quick as well, is that I forget where I saw it, but yeah, I realized that today in the US it's the National Girls and Women in Sports Day. So I want to mention that as well, that the episode's not obviously coming out today, but we are recording on February 4th, which is like the recognized day. So I just wanted to mention that it just happened to
Mm-hmm.
be we were planning this podcast, we were planning to record today and make the discussion, and then I found out at a later point, oh, it just happened to work well that it's the National Girls and Women in Sports Day. And actually I learned how it came about is that it was based off of this athlete Flo Hyman, who was a volleyball player, and actually while she was like in a tournament in Japan, she was like feeling bad and they put her on the bench, and then while she's on the bench she like collapsed and later died at the hospital. So like that's a crazy story that like she was literally competing in her sport when she passed away, and that's why they decided to select that day to be the National Women in Sports Day.
Yeah.
So with that, I also want to then ask you, putting you kind of on the spot here, if you have any like favorite athletes of all time, whether they're powerlifters or not powerlifters, anyone that you like watching or you look up to that are female athletes.
Ooh, I love this question. For those listening, I'll say small context you need about me is I did not grow up in sports. I am very much, I did swim, but it was like that summer thing type thing. And so I just did not have exposure to athletes in general as up until my 20s, I would say. So there are so many people that I would love to name, but I frankly don't know them, and that's my background. But in terms of powerlifting, I love watching Leah Beauvoir. Like I think that she's the coolest. And brings such intensity on the day of a competition. And I'm not saying that because she's a TSG athlete. I'm truly saying that because I just think she's so fun to watch. Um, and then otherwise, like, I'm such a fangirl for my own female athletes. Like, they're some of my favorite people to watch and hype up. But outside of powerlifting, um, I had the opportunity to meet Billie Jean King, like, virtually, who's like, if you don't know that name, huge in breaking the way for women, and like, absolutely tennis phenom, like, awesome person. And at the time when I met her, I like virtually, I didn't know her story because, again, I just did not have exposure. And after looking into it and looking into her, I was like, wow, she's incredible. So, if you don't know that name, look into Billie Jean King. And yeah, so I'll say Leah, is probably my favorite powerlifter to watch. My own athletes, just it's fun hyping them up. And then Billie Jean King is just one of those, like, forever such an awesome, like, story. And I obviously wasn't around at that time to watch her compete, but to hear about everything and see her pave the way for so many after her is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I'll throw out for me when it comes to powerlifting when I was like serious as far as like training and competing, like 2011 to 2015, 16 was when I was serious. So like the
Hmm.
people I kind of looked up to were like the numbers I wanted to achieve. So like the big three for me were Bonica Brown, Jennifer Thompson, and Kimberly Wofford. And so like they were the dominant people in the US and at the worlds at that time. And so I'd see like, oh, Bonica's doing a 400-pound squat or a 500-pound squat. I want to get to those numbers. Or Jen Thompson's doing a 300-pound bench press. I want to
Yeah.
get to those numbers. Or Kimberly Wofford's doing a 500-pound deadlift. I want to get to those numbers. So those were kind of like the people I was looking to during the time when I was getting into competing. Outside of powerlifting, personally, I really like UFC. I like MMA, which is both men and women, and so it's
Hmm.
cool that you get like a card with like five different fights, and it's a mix of men and women. So for me, especially when I first started watching UFC, there was no women's side to it, and the CEO Dana White's like, "Oh, we're never gonna have women fighters," and then what do you know? He ends up having women fighters, and it blows up and stuff. And so when I was watching those early people, to me, it was like Ronda Rousey was like the big name, and
Hmm.
then more recently, it's been like Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko. So those are the people I really like watching when it comes to fighting. Outside
Yeah,
of that, I think another big name is or big names are Serena and Venus Williams. And
definitely.
the movie I watched a number of years ago, King Richard, if anyone hasn't seen that, I really like that movie of like their backstory and everything like that. I thought that was really cool, showing how they kind of came on the scene and like the struggles they had to go through to get there.
Yeah, that's a great one. I also realize I would be amiss not to mention my own like person that I looked up to right when I started powerlifting and everything. Maybe not right when I started, but she doesn't know this, but I always had an internal like rival, not really rival, but like I want to be you in Chloe Dublin, who was the 72 kilo like at the time when we had 72 kilo uh like I think it was junior slash teen three, whatever it was at that point, when I was like the sub junior, and I was like, I want to be you. And it's funny because now like she also lives in Indiana, and like I have worked with her a few times on different meets, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of crazy. In my head, I used to be like, I want to be you, and now we're like talking and stuff. So, shout out to Chloe. I still want to be her.
Nice. The other name I was thinking about throwing out there is if anyone hasn't ever met or talked to Susan Elwin, she'd be an interesting powerlifter to talk to. She lives here in Florida, so I've worked with her a lot as like she's refereed and then seen her compete and stuff. And she's one of the people that's been around the sport for like decades. I remember one time at a competition, she like showed me her deadlift shoes and told me how her deadlift shoes are older than I am, and I'm pretty old. So she's had these shoes for so long.
Wow.
She's been competing for so long, and she can tell people stories about early on when she was like one of the only females competing and stuff like that. So if anyone gets to see her at a world championship or a national championship because she competes and referees and stuff, she's an interesting character, but it'd be cool to kind of talk to her about female powerlifting and some early women's national championships and stuff like that.
Definitely. And one other like what's a plug I'll make is if anybody's interested in generally the history of powerlifting, but also kind of associated to history of women in powerlifting slash strength sports, Jan Todd is an awesome like researcher, powerlifter, female in the space, and like has a huge I think it's called like strength sport history, something along those lines, at UT in Texas, and like has a lot of different publications and things to read up there. Highly recommend that. And then if you're interested in female coaching, like research on that, my favorite person to, or my favorite researcher there is Sophia Jowett. She does a ton of research on like coaching, but also females in coaching. And I think that's a awesome source to look at too.
Yeah, I think the first place you're talking about, I think it's called like the Stark Center because
Yes,
yeah,
Stark Center.
I've heard about it a bunch because it's in Austin, Texas, and we've gone for Powerlifting America to Austin, Texas for a number of like national championships. So some people have, when they were there, gone over to that Stark Center for, I think it's for physical culture and sports and seen
Yeah.
all the background as far as strength sports and just like lifting in general.
Yeah, a lot of that you can thank Jan Todd for,
Yep.
so shout out to her.
The last thing I guess I would want to bring up is if you have any like final thoughts, final words, or any ideas of like improvements that you would like to see specifically for girls and women in powerlifting?
I think wh- I think what I would love to see is just more exposure and support of namely female coaches, but also female athletes in powerlifting. I think that we are seeing a lot of drive, like we've said it almost every year now. The female or the women's side of Sheffield is maybe more exciting than the men's side. So we see some of this kind of like occurring in terms of exposure and hyping up and so on. But I think that a lot of it comes down to like continuing to like self-reflect and analyze like everybody involved, our own biases, our own like what we're sharing, information we're sharing, who we're sharing it from, if we're giving a recommendation, who we are recommending and why we're recommending them, and just kind of propping up more diverse, whether it's, you know, gender diversity, race diversity, or ethnicity, so on. Just propping up more diverse coaches and athletes, and being willing to speak out and call out things that are not in line with that. I think that's what I would love to see continued in the sport, but also see more of from people that we may not otherwise see it from.
Yep, agree. And I'll end it there. I'll let you have the final word. And if people want to discuss this further, you know, wherever they're listening, whatever platform, they can always leave comments and let us know their thoughts as far as female coaches in the sport of powerlifting. And then hopefully going forward, we'll have this topic, you know, as far as female athletes or other aspects as well. And we can maybe bring on some other coaches as well. I think Jane wants to have this kind of discussion as well. So it'd be cool maybe have both of you on and
Yeah.
talk about different aspects of this kind of topic.
Definitely. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss, and I think there's a lot of stories to be shared associated with it. So thanks for providing the platform for us to do it. But if anybody wants to continue the conversation, obviously leave a comment. You can find both of us on social media as well.
Yep. In the description, I'll throw all the social media stuff so if they want to message you directly to talk to you. Yeah, thanks again for coming on. Thanks again for everyone listening, and tune into a future episode. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks.